Well, we're in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11. If you want to go back there, that's really where our text will be. It's already been read this morning, so we won't take time to reread it. So as we're in this missions conference this week, we're talking about the potential and what could happen as we obey the Lord. And, you know, for some, it's a matter of resources. It's a matter of surrender of our hearts and our resources to the things of God. But for others, perhaps it's more than just resources. It may be your life. God may be calling some of you to give your life to the gospel. And while all of us who are saved should be a part of spreading the gospel, there are some of us who get the privilege of being involved in what we call full-time ministry, where we get to spend our life in making a difference in this world. And I have to tell you that I believe with all my heart that in this generation in which we're living, and I'm not a prophet, although I do believe that I see signs of the times, that our days are limited. In other words, I don't think it's long before Christ returns. And so as a result of that, you and I, we must ramp up our efforts in reaching our world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. In other words, this is not a time for us to sit back and say, okay, he's coming, let's do nothing. No. We are to work, the Bible says, while it's day, for the night cometh when no man can work. And we are to, the Bible uses the word occupy until he comes, which means, the word occupy means we are to doing business for him until he comes. And so it's not a time for us to take a step back, it's a time for us to take a step up. And so as I look at this passage here in Ecclesiastes, we have, I think, given principles for investment. And specifically, I want to talk to you about investment in the work of God this morning. Now think about this. There is no greater message in all the world, no greater business in all the world than the business of preaching the gospel and sharing the message of salvation. Because there is no other message and no other faith that has the truth that can save a person's life. Now we live in what we call pluralistic societies, which in many respects means you're not supposed to speak disparagingly about anything. You know, this politically correct world, you're never supposed to say a negative word about anybody's religion or politics or whatever the case may be. But the truth of the matter is, when we declare what Jesus says in John 14:6, when he says, I am the way. The little article in the English language, the means there is no other way. I am the truth, which means there is no other truth. And I am the life, which means there is no other life. And then he said, just in case you didn't get that clear enough, nobody comes into the Father but by me. So that's pretty narrow when you stop to think about it, that, hey, there's only one way to heaven. There's only one door that opens the doorway to heaven, and it's through the person of Jesus Christ. Now, many of you are familiar with the 1040 window. Some of you, your heritage is there. And you know that in the 1040 window, there are three predominant religions. You have Islam, you have Buddhism, and you have Hinduism. And of course, those religions, they speak of God, but they don't speak correctly of God. They don't tell the truth about God. And so we have a responsibility, of course, to take the truth. When you have the truth, you have a responsibility. I often say when you find something good, find something that's a blessing, when you find something's helpful, then it's wrong for us to hold that to ourselves. We should be sharing that. And so as a result, we think about this idea of sharing the gospel. We think about getting the gospel to the world. And it's wrong for us when we have the truth and we know what the truth is and realize that others don't have that truth. It's wrong for us to hold that and say, well, I'm just not going to tell anybody about it. No, we have a responsibility. So let's consider the truths that are found in this passage in light of missions and world evangelism. I'm going to give you two major thoughts here this morning, and then I'm going to give you three applications of that truth. So let's notice, if you would, first of all, the first major thought that's here, that this passage speaks of an investment. It speaks of an investment. Notice in verses 1 and 2 that this investment is a personal investment. Notice what he says there, cast thy bread upon the water. So when I'm talking about bread, he's saying, look, Kevin, you have some bread. You're supposed to cast it upon the water. It doesn't say to me that I'm supposed to cast these young men's bread upon the water that's here in the front. No, it's mine. So it's personal. In other words, cast thy bread. In the English language, those pronouns in our King James Bible that begin with the letter T speak of the individual, speaking to the individual. It's not speaking to the group, it's speaking to the one person. So cast thy bread upon the water. So he's giving command there. Notice in verse number 2, give a portion. So the implication is the person that is casting the bread upon the water, now that person is supposed to give a portion to 7 and also to 8. That's an investment. Then notice, if you would, verse number 6. Notice what he says there in verse 6. He says, in the morning sow thy seed. So we're talking about doing a work here. We're talking about making an investment. So think about this. What he's saying here is that without some sort of personal investment of time, energy, and resources, we can't expect anything good is going to happen. Now look, I'm an observant man. I've been in ministry for a long time, over 41 years in ministry now. And I realize, because I've been in ministry a long time, that you don't have what you have here in this church without some effort. In other words, this choir didn't stand up and sing that beautiful song, and Pastor John Mark sang that solo without some work involved. Somebody had to get here early and learn music. The music had to be given to the instrumentalists, and the choir had to work on timing and all that stuff. That just doesn't happen. It happens because people say, hey, this is important. We're going to give some time and effort to this. You have a beautiful church building. Buildings like this just don't happen. Somebody has to sweep the carpets, and somebody has to clean the restrooms, and somebody has to paint the walls, because walls need paint from time to time, don't they? Specifically, the more people you run through it, the more there is. And I pastored a fairly significant and large church, and we would run 1,000 people through our building on Sunday morning, and I'd walk in the restrooms after it was all over with, and I was a little bit discouraged. Toilet paper every place, and paper towels, and the mirrors splattered up. And then one day it dawned on me, dummy, if there were no people here, you'd have clean restrooms. But because you have people here, the restrooms are messed up. So I'm just simply saying, things just don't happen. People have to make that happen. And what he's saying to us is, hey, if you're going to have a part in what God is doing, it's got to be personal. You've got to take some ownership. Some of you have taken some ownership of some ministry in this church. Hey, we got guys back here that run sound. We have people that run the video. We have people who are watching the doors, who are security. We have people who teach classes here. Somebody's watching the babies. Somebody say amen. Yeah, I love babies, except when there are 400 of them crying all at one time, and you're trying to preach, all right? So somebody's got to do that. It's a personal investment. It's personal. Hey, the farmer knows this, don't they? I had a man who was a part of our ministry for a while. Now he's living where my wife was grown up. My wife lived on the western side of Ohio. I was on the eastern side of Ohio. I was in Northwest, and she was on the Northwest. But she was a little bit further south. And where she came from, they do some farming. I don't do any farming in Cleveland. There's not enough property. You got to go probably, it's like here, you got to go a ways out to find some open land. And so anyway, I didn't know anything about farming, but where she comes from, they farm. They do soybean, they do corn, they do stuff like that. And so this young man who had been a part of our ministry, now he grew up there. He was part of Cleveland Baptist for a while, and then his work took him back to home. And now he was recording a video the other day, and he was recording a video of him running his combine. The combine, of course, is a piece of machinery that reaps the crop. You know why I could reap the crop? Because he said, in June, I put this crop in the ground. So think about this. If that man, it's now, he recorded this last week, so it's October. In order for there to be a harvest in October, hey, that guy had to work in June. He had to make an investment in June in order for there to be a harvest. So he'd be foolish to stand out there in October and say, hey, where's my crop? Well, excuse me, sir, did you work in June putting some seed in the ground? No, I didn't do that. Well, if I didn't do that, then I can't expect that there's going to be a harvest. If without the investment, there's no return. You understand what I'm saying? You can't expect that there's going to be a return unless I'm willing to make the investment, and it's a personal investment. Notice the second thing about this investment. Notice not only that is it not only is it personal, but it's a practical investment. Notice what he says. He says, cast your bread upon the water. Sow thy seed. When we think about bread, of course, we think about things that bread is, of course, the staff of life. Jesus said that there was a sower that went forth to sow, and obviously we think about the word being the seed. And when he talks about water here, in some respects, when you talk about water, you talk about the fact that in the Bible sometimes you'll find that water is a representation of humanity. So when we think about this practical investment, Hey, look, many times we hear people saying, hey, the world needs improvement. And nobody would argue that our world needs some help, right? I mean, we look at our world and we look around and we see it. And sometimes you go to what we call third world countries, we don't think anything about, because we live in developed nations, we don't think anything about, I got up this morning and I just punched a light switch and man, pop, the lights come on. I walked in the shower last night, man, I turned that handle on and man, it wasn't hardly a few seconds and hot water was streaming and I was able to take a nice warm shower. But you know as well as I do, in some countries that's not the case. Clean water, electricity, constant light, some of that. So we look at countries like that and we say, hey, you know what they need? They just need some help. They need somebody to come and teach them how to have electricity and how to have water and how to plant crops and how to make a living. And we think things like that. But can I tell you the greatest need that they have, although those are needs, don't get me wrong, we should help them in ways we can help them. But you could help them all day long with how to have water and electricity, and they could die and go to hell. See, this life is temporary. We must get them not only help in that regard, but we need to get them the most important truth, which is how to have eternal life. And so when we think about this casting your bread upon the water, it talks about a personal investment. We're encouraged to use our lives and resources as an investment. We're to be sowers. Think about this, as we give our life. One of the reasons I'm convinced that God wanted me to leave the pastorate and do what I'm doing is because God's doing something in that 1040 window. There's a stirring there. I am convinced that God doesn't stir us to leave things or to do something that He's not already at work there. And so I'm just telling you that as a result of that, I cannot do but what God has called me to do. I mean, the easiest thing for me to do is to continue pastoring the church that I was pastoring. It wasn't like they were chasing me out. They kind of liked me there. That was nice. It's always good when your church family smiles at you when you stand to preach, and they're with you, you know what I'm saying? And they're encouraging, and they were. But God was working in my life and saying, hey, there's something else that I have for you. There are people, you stand many times and preach to the same people week after week and month after month and year after year and decade after decade, and there are people out there who have never one time heard the gospel. What are you going to do about that? Well, I've got a life. I've got a little bit of gift. And I can take that and cast it upon the water. So it's a personal investment. It's a practical investment. But once you notice also that it's a protected investment. Notice what he says in verse number 1. Cast thy bread upon the waters, and thou shalt find it after many days. When God makes a promise, it's more powerful and more sure than anything else in this world. It's the most powerful thing that there is. When God promises things in His Word, we can, in many respects, just say, hey, that's like a check that's been signed by God and I can cash it. Luke chapter 6 and verse 38 says, give and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure you meet withal, it shall be measured to you again. I've been amazed in my life how, as I have given, God has given back. And by the way, God doesn't always give us what we call financial blessings. Although I've never starved to death and I've always been able to pay my bills. But can I tell you, you can't put a price tag on a great marriage. You can't measure having children who love the Lord and serve the Lord and raise your grandchildren in church. You can't put a price tag on that stuff. I'm just simply saying, when we are obedient to God, God says, look, if you'll do what I ask you to do, hey, you'll give, and I'm going to give back, and I'm going to make sure that you have what you need. This is His promise. Matthew chapter 16, verse 25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. Did not Jesus say when we make an investment in His work that it's protected? In Matthew chapter 6, and what we know is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about give and it shall be given to you. He said, look, don't worry about everything. Take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, what you shall put on. He said there, don't lay up for yourselves treasures here on this earth. But here's what He did say. He said, lay up treasure in heaven. I talked to you about my neighbor on Friday night who was a hoarder. And I said he just stuffed stuff into his garage, and he stuffed stuff into his attic, and he stuffed stuff into those outbuildings. You know, when he died that day, when they pulled that sheet over his head, they took him out on that gurney to the ambulance. I was heartbroken. Because here's a man who made all of his investments on this earth. He thought it was valuable. That's what he gave his time to. And because I shared with you that I tried to witness to him, and he just always brushed me off and said, hey, I don't have time for that. Unless he made a decision that I didn't know about. When he drew his last breath here, he took his first breath in a place called hell. And by the way, he left everything behind. But if you're saved and you make this investment that we're talking about, we're giving to the Lord, we're giving to missions, we're giving beyond ourselves, we're being obedient to the Lord, guess what you're doing? You're laying up treasure in heaven. That's a protected investment. That's a protected investment. Jesus said, look, you can do that. And by the way, no thief can break through and steal. Back in the 1980s, I was driving a church vehicle. It was a 1984 Caprice Classic. And it was a nice automobile. This was back in the 80s. And so it was one of those big cars. And so I took it home one night, and I put it in the backyard, and I was laying in my bed, and the phone rang at about 11 o'clock. Well, whenever your phone rings at 11 o'clock at night, you know, it's not normally good news, is it? Most of the time it's not, hey, we just want to call and check on you. No. Somebody's calling, giving you some news. So I picked up the phone, and they said, hello, Mr. Folger. And when they didn't call me Kevin, I knew something was up. And so they said, Mr. Folger, this is the Brooklyn Police Department. We've recovered your car. I said, no, you didn't. My car's in the backyard. No, sir, we have your car. I said, hold on for a minute. I ran to the back of the house and looked out, and sure enough, my car was gone. They had stolen my car and recovered it before I even knew it was gone. Next day, I went to pick that car up, and they had taken all the wheels off of it. They had peeled the steering column, pulled out the radio. I got it fixed. Insurance company fixed it, got the wheels back on it, all restored. The youth pastor of our church said, hey, we're having our junior senior dinner. Can I borrow your car? It's a nice car. I'd like to have something nice to drive. I said, sure, take it. He took it home that night. He called me the next morning. He said, they stole that car again. I'm telling you, there's some things here you can't keep. You know, when you have something stolen from you, you feel like you've been violated. But here's what I want you to know. If you lay up treasure in heaven, it can never be stolen. You're never going to lose it. It's never going to decay. It's never going to get old. You never have to paint it again or fix it. It's there forever. It's a protected investment. So that's our first thought, the investment. Notice, secondly, the uncertainty of the investment. When you say, well, I thought you said it was protected. Well, notice a couple things. First of all, there are some things that you cannot see about an investment. This picture described here, he says in verse number 1, he said, cast thy bread upon the water, for thou shalt find it after many days. Now, this is a picture that is given to us that you have to do a little research in order to be able to discover exactly what's being said here. So here's what I want to do. I want to paint the picture for you so you understand what's being said. It's planting time in the Middle East. So when it's planting time, what comes right before planting time, of course, is the rainy season. So the rains have come in the Middle East, and normally what happens when rains come, sometimes an abundant rain, what do you find? You find many times streams and creeks and things like that, they swell. And so here's a man who's got a piece of property, and evidently his property butts up against some water body, and as a result of the rains, that water body has overflowed its banks and has come now onto his property. But he's got a responsibility. He realizes, hey, look, I only have a window of time to get my crop in. So the water's there, and so here's what this man does. And I want you to think with me in this old terms of what they used to do. And so what they would do is a man would have what is known as a seed basket. He'd strap it on himself, and he'd strap it on his hip, and he'd wade out into his water. Now, he's got a piece of property, and he knows approximately where that water banks is supposed to be, but it's flooded, but he's still got to get his seed in. So what he does is he takes that crop and he throws that seed upon the water. He lets it hit the water, and then when it hits the water, it hits that top of that water, it begins to saturate with the water, and here's what it does. It becomes heavy. And it sinks down to the bottom of the earth and finds that resting place in that murky water, in that mud there at the bottom where his land is. Over time, as the sun comes out and the rains quit coming, what happens is that water begins to recede. It goes back into its body or banks. Well, he's cast his seed upon the water. He has a level of uncertainty. Some things he cannot see, some things he cannot know. All right, I know I've done what I'm supposed to do. Now I have to wait. Have you ever planted grass seed? Grass seed is the most frustrating thing in the world for me. You have a bare piece of ground. They tell you, buy this grass seed, and in a little while you'll get to see your grass come. Man, I throw it out there, and man, it sits there, it seems like 2 weeks. It does nothing. I mean, it's like it's just sitting there, and you water it, still nothing. And then one day you walk out there, and all of a sudden you see these little emerald shoots coming up. And that's really what the picture is here, is this man. He's walked out, cast your bread upon the waters, for you shall find it after many days. He's thrown that seed on this murky, dark water. Now here's what I want you to know. When we talk about this investment that we're speaking of, whether it's resources of our lives, there are just some things you're not going to know. There are some things that perhaps we won't know until we get to heaven. You know, we sometimes, as churches, and part of our responsibility is not just to reach the world, we're to reach our Jerusalem. You're to reach Vancouver. And I know your church has outreach and special days in which you put stuff out there. And sometimes you say, you know, I've gone, I don't know how many times I've gone, and I don't know that I've ever seen any results from my work. It seems like people aren't home, and sometimes, you know, somebody will take it and they'll just take the track. I never see that person again. Can I tell you there's some things you'll never know, or perhaps you have to wait a period of time before you'll know? Let me use this illustration. Our church at our Cleveland Baptist for 50 years has had a men's prayer meeting every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. And so I would leave my house about 6:30, go in my office. I'd been there on Saturday, and I'd leave probably 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And many times I'd walk in my office early because I just wanted to see. We had a voicemail system. I thought maybe somebody's left me a voicemail. And sure enough, this one Sunday morning I walk in, and my light is lit up on my phone saying, hey, there's a voice message waiting for me. So it's early, so I said, well, I'll just go ahead and catch it now before the men's prayer meeting. And push the button. Here's what it said. Hello, Pastor Folger. My name is Wilma Rojas. You don't know me. I've never met you. She said, I just want to tell you that recently I've fallen on some really hard times. My husband passed away about six weeks ago, and I am so heartbroken. We've been a part of a church for a long time, but I just seem so hopeless. I just feel like my life is coming to a conclusion. I work every day, and my life is just drudgery. And I was praying the other day and said, God, I just need to know something about you. I need to know that you're real, that you really are concerned about me. She said, I came home from work the other day, and as I was getting ready to enter my house, on my gate outside my house, she said, I found a tract somebody had left from your church. She said, would you please call me back? Well, I didn't want to call her at 6:30 in the morning, so we went through our men's prayer meeting. About 8:15, I picked up the phone, and I dialed their number. I said, Mrs. Rojas, this is Kevin Folger. I'm pastor at Cleveland Baptist Church. You obviously left a message for me last night, and I'm just returning your call. She said, oh, thank you for calling me. She said, I've been raised Roman Catholic all of my life. She said, I don't feel like I have faith. I feel like it's so empty. I don't feel like there's any hope that I'll ever see my husband again. And she said, I was just getting ready to walk out the door to go to my church, thinking that that's probably what I should do. And I prayed, and I said, God, if I'm supposed to go to that other church, would you have somebody call me? Wilma came that day and attended our church. I introduced her to a few folks, and over the next couple of weeks, I continued to follow up on her. Wilma Rojas bowed her head and trusted Christ as her Savior. I don't know who left that tract behind, but somebody did. See, that person may never know until they get to heaven that they were the person who left the tract. See, some things we can't know. We just have to cast the bread upon the water. Then there's some things you can't see. Would you notice, please, that as you get to the later part of verses 5, 6, he talks about some things, maybe even verse number 4, he talks about some things that maybe would hinder us from doing what we should do, like trees that fall in the forest and clouds look like they're going to rain. And so he says, you know, if you regard those things, you're not going to sow and you're not going to reap. But notice the challenge in verse number 6. The challenge is regardless. regardless, sow your seed. Give a portion to 6 or 7 and also to 8. The idea is keep doing regardless. Though you cannot know, though you cannot see, just keep doing these things. And I'm just simply saying we might be worried a lot about things in our world. We said here today, it's 2019, it's soon going to be 2020. You know, I remember, some of you remember the year 1999, remember? The new millennium is going to dawn. And at the stroke of midnight, the world is going to melt down and burn, right? The power grid's going to fail, and there's not going to be food in the place, and the whole world is just going to fall off the cliff. Do you remember that? I remember that very, very clearly. I'm thinking to myself, why on earth did we worry about that? Because when at the stroke of midnight on December 31st and January 1st, 2000, the light stayed on. And there was still food in the stores, and there was still gasoline in the gas tanks. I'm just simply saying we worry about things that might never happen. You may be sitting here saying, you know, I don't know what's going to happen in our economy and what it's going to cost next year to live, and therefore I'm going to have to be very careful about my resources. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be careful about your resources, but when God tells you to do something, sow your seed. Give your life. Do what God wants you to do. Don't worry about the future. God can take care of that. Now, let me give you 3 applications, and we're finished here this morning, okay? Let me give you these principles. We picked them up from this particular passage. To be blessed and be a blessing, you must make an investment. We must take that which we have and use it to invest it. Now, every person sitting in this room has 3 things. You may not realize you have them, but you do have them, and all of us have some of them, and some may have more of one thing than others, but we all have some of every one of these things. Everybody here has some time. You do. You say, preacher, you don't know how busy I am. We are busy being busy, aren't we? But we all have some time that we can invest in the work of God. We have time. We all have some treasure. We all have some finances. Now, there may be some that have more than others, but all of us have some. And we all have some talent. Now, look, you're looking at a guy who has very little talent. I cannot sing. I have no rhythm. If you watch me lead a congregational song, you would have no idea where we were going, all right? I have no rhythm. I cannot play a musical instrument. I have a hard time playing a radio. So it's one of those situations where, you know, I have no talent when it comes to music. God didn't say that we have to have a lot of talent. He didn't say we had to have a lot of resources. He didn't say we had to have a lot of time. But we all have some. And if I expect to have a blessing, if I expect that when I get to heaven someday, that I'm going to be blessed, and if I expect that I'm even going to be blessed in this life, then I must be willing to take some of that God has given to me and make the investment, because without the investment, there's no return. It's like the guy looking at the ground saying, hey, where's my crop? Well, if you didn't plant the seeds, son, there's not going to be a harvest. So if you want blessings in this life, you want God to use your life, you want your children to be blessed, and your home to be blessed, and your church to be blessed, and your future to be blessed, then you must take some of what God has given to you and make the investment. The second principle is not only to be blessed and be a blessing, you must make an investment, but the second is God gives to us so that we in turn can give to others. In other words, God gave to me what gifts and talents and time and treasure that I have so that I can in turn give it to other people. I'm here today because of God's calling and because of God's gifts. I'm preaching this missions conference. I'm doing what I'm doing with Spiritual Leadership Asia because of God's gifting to me. And God has something for you as well. Listen to what it says in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse number 10. Every man as he has received the gift, so even minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. So as you receive your gift, you're to minister to it. There's a passage in Exodus 31. I normally have people turn there, but our time is getting away from us today, and so I'm not going to have you turn there. But in Exodus 31, you're going to find a story about the Lord speaking to Moses about some people that were in the congregation. And if you read the previous chapters, like chapter 25, chapter 26 of the book of Exodus, you're going to find in that particular passage that God talked to Moses about this thing called the tabernacle. And he said, look, I want you to erect the tabernacle. And he gave him all the issues about it, how it was supposed to be erected. and all the stuff that was involved in all the stuff that was supposed to be made. And here's Moses. He's the leader. Okay, Lord, how do I do that? And God answers that question in Exodus 31. He says, hey, there's a guy by the name of Bezaleel. Bezaleel's been gifted. I've given him the ability. Here's what he said. I have given him the ability to work with stone and in carvings and in construction. I've given him those gifts. And I'm also giving him some other guys, and he names them, who he said, I put wisdom in them for this particular purpose. And what is God saying? He's saying, look, they have these gifts. And by the way, those guys had the gifts. They could have done it, and they could have kept it to themselves and say, hey, I don't want to do God's work. I'm just going to do what I want to do. But that's not why God gave them the gift. So can I help you understand something? You have a voice and you can sing. God gave you that for a purpose. And it's not about you making money for yourself and becoming some superstar in the world. It's about using your gift for Him. If you're a young man and God's calling you to preach, you say, well, I don't know that I could ever stand before people and preach. Can I tell you something? Hey, if God's called you, He'll enable you. You're looking at a guy who stuttered and stammered and couldn't hardly get out of his own way when I first started preaching. And I'm just telling you, God enables us if we'll give Him ourselves. So God gifts us so that we can do His work. And then finally, the final principle that's found here is there's no way to predict what God can do and will do with what you invest in others. You have no idea what God can do and what God will do if you invest in others. I'm going to tell you this story and I'm finished. I was preaching a missions conference in Fort Worth, Texas, back in the month of early September. The pastor there, Brother Tyler Gillett's a young man, and a fine young man. He took a great legacy church, and so he had asked me to come and preach his missions conference. Well, when I showed up, there were 3 other missionary families that were there, and I knew one of them, Brother Tom Gunderman and his family, going back to Australia as missionaries, and he's got a focus on this 1040 window too. He wants to help people that he works with in Australia get back to their places where they come from to preach the gospel. And then there was this other couple, and they were focusing on Iran. And then there was this other couple, and his name was Eustace and her name was Tracy, and their last name was Karaoke. What a great name. Folger's in your cup and karaoke in your songbook. There you go, all right. So the interesting thing about Eustace and Tracy is Eustace was raised in Kenya. He was born and raised in Kenya. So during this conference, one night he stood up and he shared his testimony about his salvation and how he got to where he was. He said, I was a little boy. He said, I was about 7, maybe, I think he said 7 or 11 years of age. And he said, I was this little boy living in this village in Kenya. And he said, I'd never seen a white man, ever. And into my village this day came a white man, actually a few of them. He said, I was just overwhelmed. I had never seen anybody that was anything but me, black, dark skinned. And here comes this Caucasian, this white man. And this white man invited us to come to a meeting in which he threw up this big screen and showed the Jesus film. And it was in our language there in Kenya, which was Swahili. And he said, we heard the message in our language. He said, but I was so overwhelmed by the technology. He said, I'd never seen anything like that. I'd never seen a projector. I was so mesmerized by that moving stuff. He said, it was just overwhelming. And he said, afterwards, they gave us some food. And he said, man, that really, really helped me. And so he said, the next day, they said, hey, we're having church again. If you want to come, we'll come by and pick you up. He said, I went home and told my mom. I said, I'm going to that church tomorrow. Because if I go to your church, I got to walk about 3 hours to get to church. He said, they're coming by to pick me up. I'm going with them. So he said, I started attending, and he said, over time, he said, it began to dawn on me that, hey, this message is a message that I need. It's a message about my soul. I need to be saved. And so Eustace trusted Christ as his Savior. He was a very bright young man, and so he went through their education system, and the country of Kenya marked him to be a teacher in the upper grades, and then they also marked him, they were just about ready to move him into a position where he would be an overseer, like a principal of several schools. When God called him to ministry, and he left it all behind, and he came to America, to the Crown College of the Bible in Powell, Tennessee, to get his master's degree so that he could go back to his country as a missionary to preach the Word of God. He ended up marrying Tracy. Tracy was a single lady missionary from America who had come to his country, and they ended up getting married. After he was done with his testimony, he had said this. He said the man who led him to Christ, the missionary that came, this white man he'd seen for the very first time, he said he was from West Virginia. I went to him afterwards. I said, hey, Eustace, let me ask you a question. Was that missionary that came to your village, was his name Chuck Mattis? And his eyes got about as big as saucers. He said, yes, sir, it was. I said, let me tell you about Chuck Mattis. I was pastoring in Cleveland, Ohio, and Chuck Mattis came through Cleveland Baptist. He said, I'm trying to get to Kenya to reach Kenyans for Christ. Will you help me? Our church took him on for support. I said, we cast our bread upon the water, and we found it in you after many days. Do you imagine how many people you're going to meet in heaven, going to be there because you made an investment in some missionary? They're going to walk up to you and say, hey, you know, you don't know me, but I got saved because you invested. But you see, you got to make the investment. God blesses us, and we have no idea what God can do except that we're faithful. Would you bow your heads?